Hello and welcome to the Classici podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Classici is your one-stop shop for the wide world of cinema from Eastern Europe. Subscribers gain access to our ever-evolving library of classic and contemporary films, as well as access to filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, essays, watch lists, and more. You can sign up for a 7-day free trial today at classici.online. For this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be reading from one of our Classici companions, a series of articles that you can find now on our journal page at classici.online/journal. The Classici companion is our beginner's guide to the key filmmakers, movements and concepts in the cinema of Eastern Europe. Today, I'll be reading from our companion to the cinema of the Soviet Thaw, the post-war era of freedom that briefly transformed culture across the USSR and beyond. Propelled by political shifts under Stalin's successor Nikita Khrushchev, the Thaw was a society-wide experiment that produced some of the most vital titles in Soviet film history. Make sure to check out the links in the show description to explore our collections of classic Soviet titles and cult 60s cinema. When Nikita Khrushchev took to the floor at the 20th Communist Party Congress in 1956, he had a lot to get through. Khrushchev's infamous secret speech, delivered that night, in which he inveighed against the abuses of the Stalinist era and its cult of personality, fired the starting pistol on de-Stalinization across much of the Eastern Bloc. Over 4 hours, Khrushchev delved into the history of the purges and Stalin's personal paranoia. But he also found time for some homespun film criticism, lambasting the propagandistic panegyrics that had come to define Soviet cinema in the preceding years. Stalin knew the country and agriculture only from films, he said. Many films pictured collective farm life such that tables groaned from the weight of turkeys and geese. Evidently, Stalin thought that it was actually so. It might seem incongruous that Khrushchev would make time for cinema during such a momentous oration, but his comments spoke to the central role that film had played in creating and upholding the Stalinist myth, as well as the central role that it would have in the social, cultural and political liberalization drive that became known in the USSR as the Thaw, in reference to a 1954 novel by the countercultural author Ilya Ehrenburg. In the late 1950s, as social housing was built en masse and a new minimum wage was introduced, culture was opening up. Critical writers were published, international artists exhibited and distributed, and cultural exchange was encouraged. But it was in film, more than any other medium, that the Thaw created lasting change. Production and consumption exploded. By the mid-1960s, the USSR's average annual output was 150 films, and in the 1960s, Russia had one of the highest theatre attendances per capita in the world. The revival of Soviet film had parallels in the post-war industries of France, Italy, and Poland, and the French New Wave, Italian neorealism, and the Polish Film School all influenced a fresh generation of Soviet film students with newfound access to this foreign material. Filmmakers began to replace bureaucrats within the major studios, which also instituted new practical courses to educate the next generation of artistic talent. The directing workshops run by Michał Rom at the famous Vgik Film School and later Mosfilm in Moscow, and which nurtured the likes of Andrei Tarkovsky, Larissa Shepitko, and Gleb Panfilov, have since been cited as ground zero for the Soviet auteurism of the 60s and 70s. The Thaw changed the terms for Soviet filmmaking long after the wave of liberalization had broken and been replaced by the so-called stagnation of the long Brezhnev years. The Thaw revivified old subject matter and brought new topics to the screen. Comedies like Eldar Ryazanov's Carnival Night, proto-science fiction films like Chebotaryov and Kazansky's Amphibian Man, There were films exploring the lives of the young, like Marlen Hutsiev's I Am 20. There were films about the hustle and bustle of urban centres, like Georgi Danelia's Walking the Streets of Moscow. Perhaps the biggest thematic shift, though, was a broader reorientation of Soviet film around ordinary people. Where Stalinist film had been populated by superheroic Stakhanovite workers and subscribed to a metaphor of society as a transnational family, with Uncle Joe as the paterfamilias, Thor film made room instead for private life and lowercase f family drama. The key word in critical circles was sincerity, shorthand for a kind of revolutionary romanticism in reaction to Stalinism's varnishing of reality. In 1953, the critic Olga Shmarova, in a famous article, wrote that it was the task of the masters of Soviet cinema to depict life and people's emotional being in all their fullness, depth, and contradictory complexity. The sphere of private life, Shmarova wrote, must not be forgotten. In an article defending Marlen Hutsiev's 1958 feature Two Fyodors against conservative critics, the author Viktor Nekrasov wrote that Hutsiev's film had the most important thing, the truth of human relationships. I forgive it, Nekrasov wrote, because it is a film about people, a film with errors, but without the most terrible thing, lies. Hutsiev was a common reference point in the late 1950s. It was the Georgian-born auteur's 1956 romantic drama Spring on Zarechная Street that crystallized many of the nascent trends of Thor filmmaking. Set in a provincial Ukrainian town undergoing a post-war construction boom, the film centers on the charming odd couple romance between a literature teacher and a happy-go-lucky factory worker. It's refreshingly free of cliché and full of feeling. In the words of the film scholar Sasha Prokhorov, Hutsiev conceived of his films as reflecting the values of the period, the equal importance of the individual and the communal point of view, self-reflexivity of a new generation, and a return to the ideals of the revolution. This insistence on sincerity and interest in ordinary protagonists also informed Thor film's treatment of the war and its lingering aftermath. Stalinist film had made little room for the brutal trauma inflicted by the war on ordinary citizens. Now, though, that trauma demanded recognition. The Soviet Union lost between 10 and 14% of its entire population during the conflict. 27 million dead. Around 35% of all Soviet men between the ages of 20 and 50 killed in the space of 4 years. It was yet another Georgian import into the Moscow studio system, Mikhail Kalatozov, who created the most vivid war cinema of the Thor, with his 1957 melodrama The Cranes Are Flying, one of the most influential titles in Soviet film history. This was the first of 3 features that Kalatozov, who had been working since the 1930s, made during the Thor with his cinematographer Sergei Urasevsky, followed by Letter Never Sent in 1959, and their famous docudrama I Am Cuba from 1964. Urasevsky's swooping, liberated camera and the electrifying performance of lead actor Tatiana Samoylova won The Cranes Are Flying the Palme d'Or, the only Soviet film ever to do so. Samoylova plays Veronika, who loses both her parents and her beloved boyfriend Boris in the war and is forced to enter into an uneasy surrogate domesticity with Boris's family. The Cranes Are Flying was one of the first Thor films that foregrounded narratives of female suffering. Veronika's Tolstoyan narrative arc was a radical departure from the secular national saints of earlier war films. Indeed, there are no heroes in the film at all. As Masha Spolberg writes of the doomed lovers at the heart of the film, there is nothing exceptional about either of them. Nothing, that is, except their shared sensitivity, spontaneity, and sincerity. 2 years later, Grigory Chukhrai expanded on Kalatozov's reimagination of wartime tragedy with his film Ballad of a Soldier. The film concerns a 19-year-old infantryman, Alyosha Skvortsov, who receives a few days' leave from the front and decides to use it to return to his small home village to help his mother fix her roof. He is repeatedly delayed and waylaid by his encounters with, and efforts to help, people on the way, including a young girl named Shura, with whom he develops a chaste and innocent romance. Although the film's presentation of a Russian soldier as a beloved liberator may sit uneasily today with good reason, this film is not a celebration of martial aggression. Indeed, Chukhrai envisaged Ballad of a Soldier as an attack on the very notion of military heroism, writing in his 2001 memoir, My Cinema, that, quote, "The film had lived within me since the war, in the sense of bright pity. I felt that the film was my duty to the memory of those who'd gone to battle and not returned. I was incensed that even good films featured scenes of soldiers going into battle and dying beautifully before the viewer's eyes. In the war, I saw a lot of death, and I know that death is never beautiful. It is amoral to delight in it." Audiences and critics reacted strongly to this vision of modest service. In the words of the scholar Josephine Wall, the wounds that were cruelly, if brilliantly, exposed by the cranes of flying were healed 2 years later by Ballad of a Soldier. When the film was shown at Cannes, alongside the art house fare of Fellini, Antonioni, and Buñuel, Le Monde noted that, from time to time, it's nice to see normal and healthy people on screen. The thaw was always an ambiguous and then attenuated phenomenon. Liberalization at home was accompanied by Soviet intervention abroad, the crushing of the 1956 Hungarian uprising, the erection of the Berlin Wall in 1961, the Cuban Missile Crisis. When exactly the thaw ended is an open question, but few would argue that by the time Soviet tanks put down the Prague Spring in 1968, the forces of reaction had their hands back on the levers of cultural and social policy. In truth, the artistic advances of the period had been met with resistance from the start. Khrushchev, who was deposed as General Secretary in 1964, was a staunch conservative when it came to aesthetic matters. An exhibition of young artists at Moscow's Manege Gallery in 1962 so incensed Khrushchev that he convened a meeting of select cultural grandees at the Kremlin the following year in order to lambast them for what he saw as their moral failings. Special ire was reserved at this meeting for Marlen Houtsiev, arguably the progenitor of the cinematic thaw, and specifically for his 1962 feature Ilitch's Gate. This freewheeling portrait of Muscovite youth thus represented both a pinnacle of the thaw and its incipient decline. The film follows three young men navigating the demands of love and labour in the fluid world of post-Stalinist Moscow. Houtsiev brought in a then 22-year-old screenwriting graduate called Gennady Shpalnikov in order to make the vernacular overlapping dialogue authentically youthful. The hand-held camera work from Margarita Pelikhina incorporates documentary footage. Following Khrushchev's outburst, Houtsiev was forced to recut the film, retitling it I Am 20, which was then released in 1965. He later reassembled a third version, incorporating aspects of both previous cuts. Houtsiev's next film, July Rain, from 1967, leaned even further into a growing sense of generational tension. In contrast to the sincere recreations of the war found in Kalatozov and Chukhrai, July Rain deconstructs the very idea of commemoration. This greater cynicism about the war, and for the potential of personal and social recovery, had been captured a few years earlier in the debut feature of an auteur who would go on to define Soviet art house film throughout the Brezhnev era, Andrei Tarkovsky. His 1962 Ivan's Childhood has none of the hard-won optimism of The Cranes Are Flying or Ballad of a Soldier. The story of an orphaned child who runs dangerous reconnaissance missions for the Red Army Ivan's childhood presents us with an apocalyptic vision of the world up in arms. Ivan is driven by pain and hatred. In a symbolic sense, he is dead before the film even begins. Tarkovsky himself later wrote that, quote, "The boy immediately struck me as a character that had been destroyed, shifted off its axis by the war." Ivan's childhood spotlights not art as redemption, but the art of despair. And despair was the right word for what was to follow. From around 1966, censorship of the film industry ratcheted up. Films that could be read as critical of the Soviet state were banned with increasing regularity, such as Andrei Konchalovsky's 1967 collective farm drama Asia's Happiness. So too, though, were largely apolitical titles that strayed too far into stylistic formalism, the catch-all term used for any kind of deviation or experimentation in narrative and visual form. The first two features from the great Ukrainian artist Kira Muratova, Brief Encounters and The Long Farewell, are among the most famous victims of this renewed aesthetic conservatism. Tarkovsky's own follow-up to Ivan's childhood, Andrei Rublev, was recut several times and denied a broad domestic release. In Ukraine, a late 60s movement towards the poetic expression of national identity, which would later become known as Ukrainian poetic cinema, led to fresh crackdowns in that republic. Whatever the thaw had been, it was now definitively over. The next era of Soviet film had begun. That was the Klassiki companion to the cinema of the Soviet thaw, written and read by Sam Goff. You can find this and other companion articles on our journal at klassiki.online/journal. Make sure to check out the links in the show description to explore our collections of classic Soviet titles from the era, as well as cult 60s cinema from across Eastern Europe.